Court records from Natchez, Mississippi reveal a history that scholars quietly sidestepped for more than a century. According to documents uncovered in 1989, hidden behind a courthouse wall during renovation, a child barely past his 12th birthday commanded absolute authority over 247 enslaved people. The overseer's ledger, preserved almost intact, spans 18 months of daily operations. Each entry is signed in a practiced, deliberate hand belonging to someone who had not yet turned 13. What makes these pages alarming is not simply their survival, but the precision with which they record methods of discipline so calculated and so systematic that seasoned plantation managers from neighboring estates reportedly refused to set foot on the property. Correspondence from the local sheriff, kept under seal for 93 years by court order, mentions practices unfit for civilized discourse and concerns beyond the reach of established law. Before we turn to the story of Riverside Plantation and the boy who governed it with unchecked authority, let's look at the truth that was brushed aside for generations. What unfolded there was not forgotten by accident. It was buried. The spring of 1855 transformed Natchez society in ways that wouldn't be fully understood until decades after the war ended. Natchez stood as one of the wealthiest cities in America before the war. Its prosperity built on cotton and the labor of thousands who had no choice in the matter. The bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River held dozens of grand estates, each competing to demonstrate greater refinement and prosperity than their neighbors. Riverside Plantation occupied 1,700 acres of prime bottomland, producing cotton that fetched premium prices in New Orleans and Liverpool. The Hargrove family had established themselves among Natchez's elite through 3 generations of careful marriages and shrewd land acquisitions. Thomas Hargrove commanded respect not through inherited position, but through reputation. He ran his operation with mechanical efficiency, maintaining detailed records of every aspect of production. His wife, Caroline, came from Charleston with connections that opened doors throughout the South's commercial networks. Together, they'd built Riverside into one of the region's most profitable enterprises. Their son, William Hargrove, seemed unremarkable to most who encountered him. He attended lessons with a tutor shared among several planter families, showing particular aptitude for mathematics and memory. Other children his age found him odd. He preferred observing adults conduct business rather than playing, and he could recite production figures and commodity prices with unsettling accuracy. His father occasionally brought him to estate management meetings where the boy would sit silently in the corner, absorbing every detail of negotiations and operational discussions. The household staff noted certain tendencies. William watched people with an intensity that made them uncomfortable, studying reactions and expressions as if cataloging information for future reference. He never raised his voice or showed obvious emotion, maintaining the same neutral expression, whether witnessing punishment or receiving praise. The overseer, Jacob Stanton, mentioned to other plantation managers that the boy had an unnatural interest in discipline and would sometimes appear at the quarters without explanation, simply watching. February of 1855 brought a fever epidemic that swept through Natchez with devastating speed. The Harroves had been visiting relatives in New Orleans when news reached them that Thomas had fallen ill. He died within 3 days, followed by Caroline 5 days later. William, who'd remained at Riverside under his tutor's supervision, received word that he'd become an orphan before his parents' bodies arrived home for burial. The situation created immediate complications. Thomas Harrove's will designated his brother, Robert, as executive and guardian, but Robert lived in Virginia and wouldn't arrive for several weeks. In the interim, the plantation required management. Spring planting couldn't wait for legal formalities. Jacob Stanton assumed he'd continue running operations as before, but the will contained an unusual provision. Final authority over all plantation decisions rested with William, with the executive serving merely as trustee of the estate itself. Thomas Hargrove had apparently intended this as a formality, assuming adult supervision would guide his son until maturity. He hadn't anticipated dying before William turned 13. The day after the funeral, William walked into the overseer's office carrying his father's ledgers. "Mr. Stanton," he said in his flat, precise voice, "I've reviewed the production schedules. We're behind last year's planting rate by 8%. I need your explanation." Stanton, a man who'd managed laborers for 20 years, found himself unsettled by the boy's tone, not childish petulance, but cold assessment. "Weather delayed us, Master William. We'll make up the difference once conditions improve." Father's records show weather patterns similar to this year's occurred in 1848 and 1851. Both years achieved target rates through schedule adjustments. William placed the ledgers on the desk, already open to relevant pages. "You'll implement the 1851 protocol starting tomorrow. I expect daily reports on progress." The overseer recognized something in that moment. This wasn't a child playing at authority, but someone who'd been preparing for this role, perhaps without anyone realizing it. "Yes, sir," he said, and meant it. Word spread quickly through Natchez that young Harrove had assumed active management of Riverside. Neighboring planters expected a disaster. A child couldn't possibly run an operation of that scale. They waited for appeals to the executive for chaos as the estate collapsed. Instead, something else happened. Production increased. William implemented his father's systems with rigid precision, but he added his own modifications. He required detailed reports on every aspect of operations, cross-referencing information to identify inconsistencies. Workers who'd occasionally stolen extra rest time found themselves caught through statistical analysis of output rates. Small inefficiencies that Thomas Harrove had tolerated disappeared under William's scrutiny. The quarters became quieter. The usual sounds of evening conversation and occasional laughter faded. People moved through their tasks with focused intensity, rarely speaking unless necessary. Other plantation managers noticed the change when visiting, but couldn't identify its source. The operation ran smoothly. Discipline appeared firm, but not excessive by the standards of the time. Yet something felt wrong. Jacob Stanton started drinking more. When asked why, he'd change the subject or offer vague responses about the stress of managing spring planting. He stopped mentioning William in conversations and avoided speaking about plantation operations when possible. The few times he was pressed for details, he'd say only that the boy has his own methods before finding an excuse to leave. April brought an incident that revealed something of those methods to the wider community. A man named Samuel, who worked in the cotton house, was accused of deliberately damaging processed cotton by allowing moisture exposure. The damage amounted to perhaps 40 lb of fiber, a minor loss by plantation standards, easily written off. Samuel insisted it was an accident, that rain had blown through an open window before he could close it. The overseer believed him and prepared to assign extra work as punishment. William overruled him. "The cotton house windows face south," William said, reviewing the report. "Wind comes from the northwest this time of year. Rain couldn't have blown through that window under natural conditions." He looked at Samuel with those flat, studying eyes. "You opened that window deliberately and left it open. The question is why?" Samuel maintained his innocence, but William had already decided. "Y'all receive standard punishment," he said. 5 lashes for destruction of property. Mr. Stanton will administer them tomorrow at dawn." This seemed reasonable. Harsh, perhaps, for an accident, but within conventional bounds. The household relaxed, assuming William would follow his father's practices. They underestimated how carefully the boy had observed which rules society considered inviolable and which merely traditional. The next morning, Stanton prepared the usual location and implements. William appeared just before dawn and immediately identified problems with the arrangement. "Father's punishment area is inadequate." He said it allows the punished individual to maintain some dignity through limited visibility. That defeats the corrective purpose. He'd identified a different location, a small rise visible from multiple areas of the property. "We'll use this spot instead. And Mr. Stanton, you're too experienced at this. Your technique minimizes actual pain while satisfying legal requirements. That's not acceptable. Marcus will administer punishment instead." Marcus had never wielded a whip before. His inexperience meant the punishment would be clumsy, unpredictable, and far more painful than necessary. Several people protested, including Stanton, but William's authority was absolute under the terms of his father's will. What followed wasn't technically illegal or even unusual in its severity. 5 lashes remained 5 lashes, but William had understood something. The legal restriction counted strokes, not suffering. An experienced overseer could administer punishment that satisfied legal requirements while minimizing actual harm. An inexperienced hand made each stroke an unpredictable agony. Samuel survived, though he required 3 days to recover enough for light work. The incident might have ended there, except William wasn't finished. He announced a new policy from now on. Anyone receiving punishment would have the resulting lost work time deducted from their monthly allowances of food and supplies. Samuel's 3 days of recovery meant his rations were cut by 10% for the month. Again, nothing technically illegal. Planters had broad authority over resource distribution, but the compound effect transformed minor punishment into ongoing suffering that rippled through a family. Samuel had a wife and 2 small children. The reduced rations affected all of them. Other planters heard about the incident and dismissed it as a child's excessive response to his first management challenge. William would learn moderation with experience. They assured each other. They completely misunderstood what they were witnessing. The boy hadn't lost control or acted from emotion. He'd carefully analyzed the situation and identified a gap between legal restrictions and actual practice, a space where he could operate with impunity. More importantly, he discovered that compound consequences, each individually defensible, could create effects far exceeding their apparent severity. He began exploring that space systematically. Through late spring and into summer, William refined his approach to plantation management. On paper, everything appeared conventional. Punishment rates remained average for the region. Production met or exceeded targets. No unusual incidents drew official attention, but the character of daily life at Riverside changed in ways difficult to articulate to outsiders. William had realized something that other planters either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. Most plantation rules existed not for management efficiency, but for the psychological comfort of the owners. His father had maintained certain practices because they allowed him to see himself as a reasonable man running a necessary operation. William felt no need for that self-deception. He followed the letter of every law and custom while systematically eliminating anything that served only to ease consciences. The result was a place where everything legal was done with mechanical efficiency, stripped of any tempering mercy. He eliminated his father's practice of allowing people to visit family members on neighboring estates on Sunday afternoons. Nothing required such visits. They were courtesy, not obligation. William saw them as inefficient use of time and potential security risks.
The policy ended.
He implemented what he called efficiency monitoring, requiring detailed reports on time spent on every task. If someone took longer than the calculated average, they received reduced rations proportional to the lost productivity. The system was mathematically precise and utterly merciless. It made no allowance for age, illness, or varying skill levels. He discovered that morning wake times were customary rather than legally mandated. He moved the schedule 30 minutes earlier. When people struggled with the darker mornings, he noted their reduced early productivity and docked their allowances accordingly. The compound effect, less sleep leading to reduced performance, leading to reduced rations, leading to weakness, never appeared in any single rule, but devastated those caught in the cycle. Jacob Stanton tried to intervene multiple times. Each conversation followed the same pattern. He'd present a concern. William would ask him to identify which specific rule was being violated, and Stanton would find himself unable to point to anything technically wrong. The boy was too careful for that. It's the spirit of the thing, Stanton finally said in frustration. These practices, even if they're not illegal, they're not how decent people operate. William looked at him with those emotionless eyes. Mr. Stanton, please identify the legal or customary standard I'm violating. If you cannot do so, this conversation is wasting time that should be spent on plantation operations. The overseer began making inquiries about positions elsewhere. Other plantations seemed less profitable, less well organized, but the managers seemed able to sleep at night. That was worth something. News reached neighboring estates in fragments, odd stories that seemed exaggerated surely. A man disciplined for singing while working, charged with creating disturbances. A woman who asked for medical attention for a sick child, forced to choose between keeping her rations or receiving care because visiting the doctor meant lost work time. And William's efficiency rules permitted no exceptions. A boy who developed a limp, punished not for the injury itself, but for reduced productivity until the injury healed, creating a spiral where the stress of punishment delayed healing. Each incident investigated individually revealed nothing illegal. William was meticulous about that. But the pattern emerging from their combination was something new. A system that weaponized every legal authority to maximum effect, acknowledging no obligation beyond strict legal minimums. The summer passed in oppressive heat. Production rates remained strong. When Robert Harrow finally arrived from Virginia in June, 3 months after his brother's death, he found the estate running profitably with no obvious problems. William presented detailed reports demonstrating efficient management and strong returns. Robert, who'd expected chaos requiring his immediate intervention, was almost disappointed to find everything in order. He stayed 2 weeks reviewing operations. Nothing he observed violated standards of the time. If anything, Riverside appeared better managed than comparable estates. People seemed quieter than he remembered from previous visits, but that could be attributed to grief over Thomas's death or natural weariness around a new authority figure. William showed his uncle the ledgers every evening, walking through decisions and outcomes with precise logic. Robert found the boy's competence unsettling, but couldn't fault his reasoning. "Your father taught you well," he said.
Yes, sir. I studied everything he did. I'm applying his principles.
Robert wasn't entirely sure that was true. There was something in William's approach that felt different from Thomas's methods, more clinical somehow, but the numbers showed success. And Robert had his own business in Virginia, requiring attention. He'd been prepared to take over management if necessary. Instead, he found himself unnecessary. Before returning to Virginia, he spoke with Jacob Stanton privately. "Any concerns about William's management I should address?" The overseer hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "The boy runs things efficiently. Nothing I can point to that violates standards. But, sir, if you could stay longer, spend more time observing. Are you saying he's doing something wrong? I'm saying there's something different about how he operates, something I can't quite define. Your brother managed firmly but fairly. William manages completely. Does that make sense?" It didn't really. Robert interpreted the comment as resistance to taking direction from a child and dismissed it. He left Riverside, reassured that his nephew was proving surprisingly capable, if unusually precocious. The estate was in good hands. Jacob Stanton submitted his resignation 2 weeks later. The departure of an experienced overseer should have disrupted operations significantly. Instead, William barely seemed to notice. He promoted a young assistant named David Pritchard, who'd been managing the Cotton House inventory. Pritchard was 26, ambitious, and unlike Stanton, he had no memories of Thomas Hargrove's management style to complicate his loyalty. "Mr. Pritchard," William said during their first private meeting, "my father believed an overseer should exercise judgment and discretion. I disagree. I want someone who implements policies exactly as designed without personal interpretation. Can you do that?" Pritchard saw opportunity. Working for other planters meant constant second-guessing by owners who thought they could manage better. Here was a chance to simply execute clear instructions. "Yes, sir. Just tell me what you want done." "Excellent. I'll provide detailed protocols for all situations. Your job is execution, not decision-making. You'll be well compensated for your efficiency." The arrangement worked perfectly for both of them. William gained an instrument who followed instructions without moral qualms. Pritchard gained simplified responsibilities and better pay than most overseers. What neither of them possessed was the tempering influence of someone who'd question whether something should be done simply because it could be. William spent his evenings in his father's study, reading management manuals and correspondence from other plantations. He wasn't looking for conventional wisdom, but for gaps in oversight, opportunities others had missed. He filled notebooks with observations and calculations. developing increasingly sophisticated systems for extracting maximum productivity while remaining technically compliant with all regulations. He discovered that punishment timing mattered as much as severity. Administering discipline immediately after violation was customary but not required. He began delaying punishments by several days, during which the accused would be reassigned to the hardest labor available. By the time the formal punishment occurred, the person was already exhausted, making the same legal penalty far more devastating. Again, nothing illegal, just careful manipulation of allowed discretion. He realized that family relationships created vulnerabilities that could be exploited systematically. When someone's productivity dropped, William would reduce rations not just for that person, but for their entire family unit. Parents would work themselves to collapse, trying to prevent their children from suffering. The efficiency gains were remarkable, and no law prohibited proportional resource distribution. He identified that medical care, while morally expected, wasn't legally mandated for anything short of life-threatening injury. He began requiring people to choose between seeking treatment and maintaining full rations. Minor injuries that could have healed with a few days' rest instead fettered for weeks as people pushed through pain to avoid the economic penalty of recovery time. Each innovation was documented carefully in the ledgers. William maintained meticulous records not just of productivity, but of the mechanisms driving it. He was conducting an experiment in discovering exactly how much suffering could be legally inflicted in pursuit of efficiency. Neighboring planters noticed the changes in indirect ways. Riverside's workers stopped appearing at the Sunday gatherings that sometimes occurred when nearby estates allowed socializing. Visitors to Natchez from Riverside, when they occurred at all, seemed subdued in ways that went beyond normal difference. Traders who dealt with multiple plantations mentioned that conversations with Riverside's people felt different, briefer, more cautious, like speaking with prisoners rather than laborers. But when planters discussed concerns in their private clubs, they couldn't articulate anything concrete. Yes, young Harrow seemed cold for his age, but he was managing effectively. Yes, his methods seemed harsh, but were they harsher than conventional standards? When examined individually, each policy fell within accepted norms. The cumulative effect was harder to define, existing more as an impression than a fact. Some attributed the atmosphere to William's youth. Perhaps workers were unsettled by taking orders from a child and would adapt with time. Others suggested that losing both parents had understandably affected the boy's temperament. A few recognized something darker, but convinced themselves it would moderate as William matured. They were wrong about that. William turned 13 in August of 1855. His uncle sent a letter of congratulations and a gift, a leather-bound journal for recording his observations and decisions as a planter. William began using it immediately, filling pages with detailed analyses of human behavior under varying conditions of stress and deprivation. The entries read like scientific observations, clinically documenting cause and effect with no trace of empathy or moral consideration. The harvest season approached, traditionally the most intensive period of plantation operations. This would be William's first harvest, managing independently from start to finish. He'd been planning for months, developing strategies to maximize output while exploiting every legal authority at his disposal. What emerged that fall would finally force the broader community to confront what was happening at Riverside. Not because William violated any laws, but because his absolute adherence to them created something that violated every unspoken limitation civilized society relied upon. September arrived with the urgency that always accompanied harvest season. Cotton prices in Liverpool had reached 5-year highs, creating tremendous pressure for maximum production. Other planters extended work hours and intensified their demands, knowing their workers could endure a few weeks of hardship for exceptional profit. William saw the same opportunity, but understood it differently. He'd calculated that the harvest period represented a unique window. The carton needed picking within a specific time frame or would be lost. This created leverage. The crop's value was so great that almost any temporary measure could be justified as economically necessary. Laws and customs that might normally apply could be suspended just for the harvest without setting permanent precedents. Other planters had made similar calculations for generations. The difference was they imposed limits based on what they could morally justify to themselves. William had no such constraints. He implemented what he called surge protocols, detailed in his journal with mathematical precision. Work hours extended to the maximum daylight allowed. Rest periods were reduced to technical minimums. Food rations were redistributed to provide more calories to the most productive workers, less to those who couldn't maintain pace, creating Darwinian pressure to exceed physical limits. The innovation that shocked even David Pritchard was the family accountability system. William organized people into family units and measured their collective output. If any family member's productivity dropped below target, the entire unit's rations were reduced proportionally. This created intense internal pressure. Parents, children, siblings, all desperately monitoring each other's performance, knowing that one person's weakness would harm everyone they loved. A woman named Hannah had a daughter, maybe 7 years old, who became ill with a fever during the second week of harvest. Hannah faced an impossible choice under William's efficiency rules. Keep working at reduced effectiveness while worrying about her child, or take time to provide care and trigger the family productivity penalties. She tried to do both, working the fields while the girls stayed alone in their cabin, but her distraction showed in her output. William reviewed the numbers and implemented his protocol. The family's rations dropped by 15%. Hannah's husband, Robert, worked himself to exhaustion trying to compensate, picking cotton until his hands bled. Their other 2 children, both under 10, were added to the field crews to boost family productivity. The 7-year-old, still feverish, was brought to the edge of the field so Hannah could check on her during the brief rest periods. The child's condition worsened. Hannah begged for permission to take her to the doctor in Natchez. William consulted his protocols and explained the choice. She could make the trip, but the lost work time would trigger additional family penalties and medical expenses would be deducted from future rations, or she could continue working. And if the child's condition became life-threatening, which he would determine based on clearly defined symptoms, he would authorize medical care at estate expense. This was the cruelty of William's system. Every choice was technically available, but each came with calculated consequences that made the humane option nearly impossible to choose. Hannah kept working. The 7-year-old died on the 4th day of her fever. William recorded the death in his ledger with clinical precision harvest day 16. Family unit age 12 reduced by 1 juvenile non-productive member. Minimal impact on unit efficiency. Medical expense avoided $8. Note grief period traditionally granted in such cases, but harvest timeline critical. Grief accommodation deferred until post-harvest. Hannah received 2 hours to bury her daughter, then returned to the field because the alternative was watching her surviving children starve. Word of this incident spread to neighboring estates despite William's attempts to restrict communication. The planters' reaction was complex. Everyone understood that harvest season required hard choices, that operations couldn't stop for every individual tragedy. Deaths occurred on all estates. That was the brutal reality of the system. But something about William's calculation, the explicit economic analysis of a child's death, disturbed even men who'd made similar choices themselves. The difference, they realized, was that they'd convinced themselves such decisions were reluctant necessities made with regret. William demonstrated no regret, only mathematics. He'd stripped away the moral pretense they all relied upon to sleep at night, exposing the raw mechanics of their world with uncomfortable clarity. A group of planters visited Riverside in late September, ostensibly to discuss regional cotton prices, but actually to assess the situation. William received them cordially, offering refreshments and detailed production reports. The estate looked well organized, the fields productive, operations running smoothly. Nothing appeared obviously wrong. They tried to raise concerns, obliquely. "We've heard your harvest practices are quite intensive, William." "Yes, sir. The surge protocols I've implemented have increased yield per acre by 17% over last year." "Would you like to see the analysis? I'd be happy to share the methodology. We're more concerned about the welfare of your people during this intensive period. All legal requirements are being met precisely. I have documentation if you'd like to review it. Rest periods comply with state guidelines. Rations meet minimum nutritional standards as defined by the Agricultural Board. Medical care is provided for life-threatening conditions as required by law. Is there a specific regulation you believe is being violated? They couldn't identify one. That was the problem. William had studied every law, every custom, every written standard, and was operating exactly at the legal minimum for each one. Individually, none of his policies exceeded conventional boundaries, but their combination created conditions that, while lawful, felt fundamentally wrong. It's not about specific regulations, one planter finally said. It's about human decency, about recognizing that there are moral obligations beyond legal minimums. William looked at him with those flat analytical eyes. Sir, could you please define human decency in operational terms that I can implement consistently? What specific actions does it require and which does it prohibit? Without clear definitions, I can't incorporate subjective standards into management protocols. The man had no answer. How could he explain to a 13-year-old that some things shouldn't need explicit rules because civilized people understood them instinctively? How could he articulate that the function of unwritten customs was precisely to fill the gaps between legal minimums and moral behavior? William had identified that gap and was systematically exploiting it. He operated in the space between law and morality, the territory that society had always relied upon conscience to regulate. But conscience required empathy, and William possessed none. The planters left Riverside unsettled but impotent. They'd found nothing actionable, no violation they could report to authorities or use to justify intervention. William was simply being more explicit about the mechanics they all participated in, stripping away the comfortable fictions they maintained. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Natchez intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The harvest continued through October. Production numbers exceeded all projections. Riverside would post record profits for 1855, but the cost was becoming visible in ways that transcended economics. The people at Riverside had developed a particular quality that visitors found deeply unsettling. They moved through their tasks with mechanical precision, rarely speaking, showing no expression. It wasn't submission exactly. That implied some underlying emotion being suppressed. This was something closer to shutdown, as if they'd learned that any display of feeling, positive or negative, could be weaponized against them under William's protocols. William had discovered something that perhaps no planter before him had fully understood. Human beings could function for extended periods in conditions that should have broken them if the system was designed with sufficient precision. The key was preventing not just resistance, but even the mental formation of resistance. This required eliminating any space for autonomous thought or emotional processing. His family accountability system achieved this brilliantly by making every person's suffering contingent on their family's collective performance. He ensured that everyone spent their mental energy monitoring and pressuring each other rather than considering their own circumstances. A person who might have contemplated resistance would instead focus on ensuring their child or spouse didn't trigger group penalties. He'd also realized that unpredictability was a powerful control mechanism. His protocols appeared to follow clear rules, but William exercised discretion in their interpretation, applying them inconsistently in ways that seemed arbitrary. This prevented anyone from developing reliable mental models of cause and effect. They couldn't learn to avoid punishment because the relationship between action and consequence was deliberately obscured. One of his most effective techniques was requiring detailed confessions when productivity dropped. If someone's output fell below target, they were required to appear before William and explain why. The explanation had to be detailed and specific. Vague responses triggered additional penalties, but any reason they provided would be analyzed and used against them. If someone said they were tired William would note they'd admit it to lacking necessary vigor and assign them to lighter duties with reduced rations appropriate to their diminished capability. If they cited illness, he'd require medical documentation at their expense. If they mentioned family concerns, those family members would receive additional scrutiny. The only safe response was to accept full personal blame, which William would note in his records as evidence of inadequacy justifying reduced status. This created a psychological trap. People were required to explain their failures, but any explanation they offered would harm them. The exercise served no practical purpose beyond demonstrating their absolute lack of control over their own narrative. David Pritchard, the overseer, had initially thought implementing William's protocols would be straightforward. Just follow the detailed instructions. He'd underestimated how difficult it would be to enforce systems designed explicitly to maximize suffering within legal bounds. He found himself lying awake at night, replaying the day's events, and struggling with what he was participating in. He tried raising concerns once. Sir, the family accountability system, I understand its efficiency benefits, but it's creating situations where people are punishing each other, monitoring each other constantly. It's turning family bonds into sources of stress rather than support. William nodded thoughtfully. Yes, exactly. That's the design. Family relationships represent potential resistance networks, emotional connections that could enable collective action. By weaponizing those relationships, we transform them from threats into control mechanisms. The people maintain their family structures, which prevents the despair that would reduce productivity. But those structures now serve our management purposes. Elegant, isn't it? The boy spoke about human relationships with the detachment of an engineer describing machine components. Pritchard realized William didn't lack understanding of how people functioned. He understood perfectly. He simply felt no moral obligation beyond what law required. But, sir, doesn't it concern you that the people are suffering in ways that go beyond what's necessary for operations? Define necessary, Mr. Pritchard. If suffering increases productivity, which the data clearly shows it does, then it's operationally necessary. Are you suggesting we should sacrifice efficiency for sentiment that would be irrational? Pritchard had no response. The logic was airtight if you accepted its fundamental premise that productivity was the only value that mattered, that people were merely instruments for generating it. William had accepted that premise fully without reservation and was implementing its implications with perfect consistency. The overseer continued his duties, but began documenting William's protocols in private notes, sensing that someday someone would need to understand what had happened at Riverside. He couldn't stop it, but perhaps he could at least preserve evidence. November arrived with the cotton harvest nearly complete. Riverside would show exceptional returns with production up 23% over the previous year, despite losing 3 months to Thomas Hargrove's death and the management transition. By any economic measure, William's first season as plantation manager was a remarkable success, but the human cost was becoming visible even to those who tried to ignore it. People from Riverside, when they occasionally appeared in Natchez for necessary business, looked haunted in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. They moved with a particular cautiousness, as if constantly anticipating observation and judgment. They avoided eye contact and spoke in brief, careful sentences, volunteering no information beyond what was explicitly requested. Traders who dealt with multiple estates mentioned that something had changed at Riverside. They couldn't define it precisely. The people there weren't rebellious or obviously mistreated by the standards of the time, but interacting with them felt wrong, like speaking with people who'd learned that any word might be used against them, that any human connection could become a liability. Some townspeople began refusing to trade with Riverside, claiming vague objections or scheduling conflicts. They didn't want to articulate their real concern that witnessing the results of William's management made them complicit in something they couldn't defend even to themselves. A Methodist minister, Reverend Thomas Clark, tried to visit the estate to conduct religious services, as was traditional on many plantations. William received him politely and explained that while people were free to worship as they chose during their allotted rest periods, estate time could not be devoted to religious activities. Services, if the Reverend insisted on conducting them, would need to occur after dark and would count against workers' sleep time. But William, the Reverend protested, religious instruction is customary and considered morally necessary. Your father always permitted Sunday services. Father permitted many things that weren't operationally optimal. I'm sure you understand, Reverend, that I have a responsibility to manage this estate efficiently. If people choose to sacrifice their rest time for worship, that's their decision. But I won't subsidize religious activities with productive hours. Clark left shaken. He dealt with planters who were indifferent to their workers' spiritual welfare, even some who were openly hostile to religion. But William wasn't hostile. He was simply indifferent in a way that was somehow more disturbing. He didn't object to worship. He just calculated its cost and declined to pay it. The Reverend began making inquiries about whether William's guardianship could be challenged. He found that legally, everything was in order. The will was clear. Robert Harrove had reviewed operations and found no problems, and William hadn't violated any laws that would justify court intervention. The system had no mechanism to address what was happening because what was happening operated entirely within the system's rules. December brought the year's end and with it accounting season. William prepared detailed financial reports for his uncle documenting Riverside's exceptional performance. The estate had generated 37% more profit than the previous year, an extraordinary achievement that would cement William's reputation as a management prodigy. He wrote to Robert Harrove, "The surge protocols implemented during harvest proved highly effective. I recommend considering similar approaches for next year's operations. I have documented all procedures and would be happy to share the methodology with other estate managers in the family's network." Reading that letter, Robert felt deep unease despite the impressive numbers. Something about his nephew's tone, the clinical description of procedures and protocols, suggested that William viewed plantation management as a purely technical challenge devoid of moral dimensions. Robert had seen similar attitudes in men who'd lost their humanity through years of participating in a brutal system. It disturbed him to see it in a 13-year-old who'd been managing independently for less than a year. But what could he do? William was family. The estate was profitable, and technically everything was legal. Robert convinced himself that his nephew's coldness was just adolescent awkwardness, that maturity would bring wisdom and compassion. He'd tell himself that for years, long after evidence made it impossible to believe. As 1855 ended, Riverside Plantation stood as a financial success and a moral catastrophe. William Hargrove had proven something that perhaps shouldn't have been proven, that a system with sufficient legal authority and no moral constraints could reduce human beings to purely instrumental existence, stripping away everything that made life worth living while keeping them alive enough to be productive. The next year would reveal just how far that system could be pushed before something finally broke. January of 1856 brought cold unusual for Mississippi. Frost appeared on the fields for the first time in several years, and temperatures dropped low enough that people needed more substantial clothing than their summer weight garments provided. This created a problem under William's resource management protocols. Clothing disbursement occurred on a fixed schedule, once in March, once in September. The unusual cold arrived between scheduled distributions requiring discretionary allocation. William's father would have provided extra garments as needed. William saw an opportunity for another experiment. He announced that supplemental cold weather clothing would be available through a work credit system. People could earn points through extra productivity that could be exchanged for warmer garments. The most productive workers would receive adequate protection. Those whose output was merely average would need to manage with what they had. Those performing below standard would receive nothing beyond legal minimums. The system immediately created visible stratification. Within a week, Riverside's community was divided into those who could afford warmth and those who couldn't. The effect on morale and health was devastating, but productivity actually increased initially as people pushed themselves desperately to earn clothing credits. William documented the results meticulously. He was testing whether artificial scarcity of basic necessities could drive performance even among people already working at maximum capacity. The data suggested it could, at least temporarily. He noted that the system's effectiveness would likely decline as health impacts accumulated, but for short-term productivity spikes, it showed promise. A man named Solomon, who worked as a carpenter, had maintained adequate productivity through the harvest, but found himself struggling in January. He was 53, old by the standards of the time and place, and the cold affected him severely. His output dropped 15% in 2 weeks. Under William's protocols, this disqualified him from earning clothing credits. Solomon tried to explain that he needed warmer clothes to maintain productivity. The cold itself was reducing his capability. William listened patiently, then explained the logic. If you're performing below standard because of cold, that demonstrates you're more susceptible to temperature variations than others. Allocating limited warm clothing resources to you would be inefficient. You'd benefit less than someone whose baseline productivity is higher. The rational allocation is to provide clothing to those who can best utilize it. This was the essence of William's system. It took reasonable-sounding economic principles and applied them with perfect consistency to situations where they became monstrous. Market efficiency logic worked fine for commodity distribution, but became nightmarish when applied to human necessities with life or death implications. Solomon's productivity continued declining as the cold persisted. He developed a respiratory condition that would have been manageable with adequate warmth and rest. Under William's protocols, he received neither. He died in February, and William recorded it as natural attrition of age-low productivity unit. Several similar deaths occurred that winter. Each one was individually defensible. The people were old or sick. The cold weather was an unusual circumstance. Medical care was provided when conditions became life-threatening by legal definition. But the pattern was clear. William's resource allocation system had effectively triaged people by productivity, providing protection to useful workers while allowing others to die from exposure. The neighboring planters could no longer ignore what was happening. A group of them, led by a man named Charles Fairmont, whose estate bordered Riverside, approached Robert Harrove with their concerns during his next visit. "Your nephew is running that estate like it's a business optimization problem," Fairmont said. "There's no humanity in his management. People are dying from conditions that could easily be prevented." Robert had been reviewing the financial reports and was struggling with their implications. The numbers were remarkable. Riverside was now the most profitable estate per acre in the region. But the methods producing those returns were difficult to defend, even to himself. "Is William breaking any laws?" he asked. "That's not the point." It's exactly the point. If he's violating regulations, we can act through proper channels. If he's not, what you're really asking is whether we should intervene in a legal operation because we're uncomfortable with its methods. Fairmont struggled to articulate the problem. There are standards beyond written law. There's an understanding among civilized people about how human beings should be treated. William is violating that understanding, even if he's following legal technicalities. Then perhaps those understandings should be codified into law. Robert said, "Until they are, I have no authority to override my nephew's management decisions based on subjective moral standards. The estate is his responsibility under his father's will." This was the system's fundamental weakness. Now fully exposed, it had created enormous legal authority with minimal legal constraints, relying on the conscience and social pressure to prevent abuse. William possessed no conscience, and he'd learned to deflect social pressure by demanding specificity that moral intuitions couldn't provide. Charles Fairmont made one more attempt. "Robert, I knew your brother. Thomas was a firm manager, but a decent man. What's happening at Riverside now isn't what he would have wanted. You have a moral obligation." "I have a legal obligation," Robert interrupted, "to honor my brother's will and preserve my nephew's inheritance." unless you can show me specific violations of law or demonstrate that William is mentally unfit for management, which his financial results clearly refute, I can't intervene. I'm sorry, Charles, I truly am. But this is a legal matter, and legally everything is in order. The planters left frustrated and frightened. They'd realized something. System they all participated in had no internal mechanism to prevent what William was doing. Every safeguard they'd relied upon, conscience, social pressure, unwritten customs, moral intuition, failed when confronted with someone who simply ignored them while following every explicit rule. If William could operate this way with impunity, what prevented others from adopting similar methods? The question haunted them because they knew the answer. Nothing prevented it except their own choice to maintain moral constraints the system didn't require. William had revealed that those constraints were voluntary, and voluntary restrictions in a competitive environment inevitably erode. Some of them began questioning their own practices, recognizing similarities between what they did and what William did, differences of degree rather than kind. That recognition was deeply uncomfortable. It was easier to see William as an aberration, a uniquely damaged individual, than to confront how much of his system simply made explicit what they'd all participated in through comfortable self-deception. Spring arrived, bringing warmer weather and the start of another planting season. The winter had reduced Riverside's population by 12 people, mostly elderly or infirm individuals who couldn't survive the combination of cold and inadequate clothing. William noted the reduction with satisfaction. It improved the estate's productivity to population ratio. He was now 13 years old, approaching 14. His management techniques had become increasingly sophisticated, his understanding of human psychology more refined. The ledgers from this period read like experimental journals documenting tests of various hypotheses about motivation, compliance, and control. David Pritchard finally reached his breaking point in April. He'd spent months implementing protocols that violated every instinct he possessed, watching people suffer under systems he helped enforce. The money was good, but it couldn't compensate for what it cost him to look in a mirror.
It is true.
In a moment of conscience that he knew was futile, but couldn't suppress, included a detailed letter describing William's management methods and their human consequences. Someone needs to know what's happening here, he wrote to Robert Hargrove. Even if nothing can be done legally, someone needs to understand what this boy has created. William accepted the resignation without apparent concern. Thank you for your service, Mr. Pritchard. Your implementation of the protocols was adequately efficient. I'll provide a positive reference if you need one. The casual dismissal was somehow more chilling than anger would have been. Pritchard left Riverside feeling like he'd escaped something, though he'd carry guilt about his participation for the rest of his life. William promoted another assistant and continued operations without disruption. He'd learned that overseers were interchangeable. The protocols were sophisticated enough now that they implemented themselves. He needed someone to execute instructions, not to think. That was easily replaced. As spring planting progressed, whispers about Riverside spread through the regional network of estates. William's methods were discussed in private clubs and church meetings, always in tones mixing horror and fascination. Some planters condemned his approach as inhuman. Others wondered quietly whether his techniques might be adapted for their own operations. The efficiency gains were undeniable after all. A few men began implementing modified versions of William's protocols. Not the full system, they assured themselves, just selective elements that seemed particularly effective. The work credit systems, the family accountability metrics, the calculated delays in punishment. They told themselves they were applying these tools humanely with proper moral constraints. William had proven the techniques worked. They would use them more responsibly. This was perhaps his most lasting impact. He'd introduced methods that once demonstrated as effective would inevitably spread through a competitive system despite moral objections. Other planters might lack his systematic coldness, but economic pressure would push them towards similar practices. William had shifted the baseline for what was considered acceptable through sheer proof of possibility. The boy himself seemed unaware of the broader implications of what he'd done. He focused on his estate, refining his protocols, achieving ever higher productivity numbers. If he thought about his reputation at all, it was only to take satisfaction in being proven correct. His methods worked, and efficiency was its own vindication. By summer of 1856, Riverside had become a test case for a question that society wasn't ready to confront. What happens when someone with absolute legal authority and no moral constraints operates a system designed to give humans power over other humans? William had provided an answer documented in meticulous detail across hundreds of ledger pages. The answer was worse than anyone wanted to believe possible. The full scope of William Hrove's operations at Riverside wouldn't be understood until long after the system that enabled them collapsed. When the war came in 1861, William was 19 years old and had been managing the estate for 6 years. The techniques he developed had been refined into something approaching systematic perfection, a complete methodology for extracting maximum productivity from human beings while operating entirely within legal bounds. Robert Hargrove made one final attempt to intervene in 1859. Disturbed by reports that continued reaching him despite his attempts to dismiss them, he spent 2 weeks at Riverside observing operations carefully and reviewing William's extensive documentation. What he found was financially successful and legally impeccable. It was also profoundly disturbing in ways he struggled to articulate. "William," he said during their final conversation before returning to Virginia, "I can't point to any specific regulation you're violating, but there's something fundamentally wrong with how this estate operates. The people here aren't living. They're merely surviving. There's no joy, no hope, no dignity. That has to matter." William looked at him with those same emotionless eyes he'd had as a child, now in a young man's face. "Uncle Robert, I appreciate your concern, but I've been entrusted with managing this property profitably within all legal constraints. That's precisely what I'm doing. If you believe the legal constraints are insufficient, I encourage you to advocate for different laws, but I can't manage based on subjective feelings about dignity or hope. Those concepts aren't operationally defined." Robert left knowing he'd failed. His nephew had become something he couldn't fully comprehend, a person who understood human nature with perfect clarity, but felt no obligation beyond law and efficiency. It was like watching someone perform complex moral mathematics while completely lacking the underlying axioms that gave the equations meaning. The war disrupted everything. Of course, William joined a Mississippi regiment in 1861, leaving Riverside under temporary management. He served as a logistics officer, applying the same methodical approach to military supply chains that he'd used on the plantation. His efficiency was noted in multiple reports. His coldness was remarked upon by fellow officers who found him unsettling to work with. He survived the war and returned to find Riverside in chaos. The system he'd built had collapsed, not through internal revolution, but through external force. The people he'd managed with such calculated precision were gone. Some fled, others simply disappeared into the confusion of war and reconstruction. The estate itself was damaged. The infrastructure deteriorated, the records scattered. William attempted to rebuild through the 1870s, but the new labor system didn't permit the absolute control he'd previously wielded. Sharecropping still provided significant authority, but the relationship was contractual in ways that limited his options. He struggled to adapt, finding the negotiated relationships frustrating. After years of unilateral control, he never married, never formed close relationships. People who dealt with him in business noted his competence, but found him impossible to connect with on any human level. He lived alone in the main house at Riverside, managing steadily declining operations until his death in 1897 at age 55. The estate was sold shortly after, the house eventually demolished. the land divided. By the early 1900s, few people remembered the Harrove family or knew what had occurred at Riverside during the 1850s. The detailed ledgers William had maintained, the documentation of his systematic experiments in control and suffering, were stored in courthouse archives and largely forgotten. When the ledgers were discovered during courthouse renovations in 1989, historians struggled with how to interpret them. The documents clearly showed sophisticated management techniques, detailed record keeping, and remarkable efficiency. They also documented systematic cruelty operating entirely within period-appropriate legal bounds. How should history judge someone who never technically violated the rules, but used them to create something monstrous? The academic debates continue. Some historians see William Hargrove as an extreme aberration, a psychologically damaged individual whose methods were unique to his particular pathology. Others argue he was more representative than comfortable, that he simply implemented with unusual consistency and documentation what the system fundamentally permitted and even encouraged. His methods were shocking not because they were unprecedented, but because he stripped away the moral pretenses that made the entire structure tolerable to its participants. The people who lived through his management left few direct records. Oral histories collected during the Depression years include fragments of stories passed down through families, vague references to the boy master, and the cold years at a plantation somewhere near Natchez. The accounts are brief and reluctant, as if even decades later the memories were too painful for detailed recounting. One elderly woman interviewed in 1936 mentioned that her grandmother had lived through the time when the child ran things. When pressed for details, she said only grandmother never spoke of it directly. She'd say that they learned to stop feeling, stop thinking, just move through each day like it was something separate from living. She said the worst part wasn't the hardship. She'd known hardship before and after. The worst part was how completely everything felt meaningless, how there was no mercy anywhere in the world they lived in. It was like being alive, but with all the reasons for being alive removed. That description perhaps captures William Harrove's achievement better than any ledger. Could he created conditions where life continued but stripped of everything that gave it value or meaning, reduced to pure instrumental existence? He proved it was possible to do this within legal constraints with methodical precision, and that the system had no effective defense against someone willing to push every authority to its absolute limit. The buildings are gone now. The land where Riverside Plantation stood is divided among several farms with no markers indicating what occurred there. Local historians know the outlines of this story, but it rarely appears in tourist brochures or regional histories. It is too tangled, too unsettling, and far too revealing of systems that stretched well beyond one damaged child's capacity for cruelty. What survives is a warning woven through courthouse records and scattered academic essays. Legal structures cannot depend on moral instinct to prevent abuse. Power requires boundaries, clear, explicit, enforceable, not because evil is inevitable, but because a system can be operated with flawless legality by someone with no moral compass at all. William Harrove demonstrated that at 12 years old. The evidence lies in hundreds of pages, written in his own steady hand, preserved but seldom read. Story reminds us that the most chilling form of evil isn't always found in those who break the rules. Sometimes it emerges from those who obey the letter of the law with perfect discipline while possessing none of the humanity that gives the law its purpose. Was the full truth ever uncovered? Or did the documents only reveal a fraction of what happened behind those sealed doors? If this story unsettled you and you want more like it, let me know. I can take you deeper into the histories most people prefer to leave buried.